There are stories that shout and stories that sing, but some stories, they whisper. This is one of those. The wind in the prairie knows it well, and if you listen closely, truly listen, you'll hear it in the hush of the fields at night. It's a story of two souls who wandered the open road, hand in hand, hearts thumping not for the chase, but for each other. Bonnie and Clyde. Not the tale of crime and chaos the world has told you. No, this is different. This is the story you've never heard, of quiet dreams, gentle glances, long drives through sleepy towns, and a kind of love too deep to name. So lie back now. Let your breath slow. Let the quiet come over you. The stars are rising. The dust has settled. And somewhere, far away in time, a girl with curls like caramel and eyes full of dreams sits by a window, writing words no one else would dare. She is Bonnie. And this is where our story begins. Before there was Clyde, before the open roads and the hum of tires in the dark, there was a little house in Rowena, Texas, with a front porch that creaked in the summer heat. In that house, in a room filled with books and sunlight, lived a girl named Bonnie Elizabeth Parker. She wasn't famous then. She was just Bonnie. 18 years old, slight of frame, with laughter that sounded like wind chimes, and a fire behind her ribs that never went out. Bonnie loved words. She wrote poems in the corners of old receipts. She scribbled lines of verse on matchbooks and tucked them into jars. She dreamed in rhymes, daydreamed in metaphors. Her notebooks overflowed with dreams of faraway cities, of velvet dresses, of love that burned slow and bright. But more than anything, Bonnie dreamed of more. More than a town where everyone knew your name and your secrets. More than washing dishes in her mother's sink. More than the same church songs and the same train whistle each morning. At night she would lie on her back barefoot by the window and watch the moonlight drip down the glass. She would imagine herself in a car, windows down, wind in her hair, music humming low, and a boy beside her who understood the quiet ache behind her smile. She didn't know his name yet, but he was coming. She felt it like a promise written in the stars. Bonnie's mother, Emma, was a hard-working woman with hands worn soft from laundry and prayer. She didn't always understand her daughter's faraway look, but she loved her with a fierce kind of patience. Every morning Bonnie helped cook eggs and fold napkins, but in her mind she was already gone, riding trains through Chicago, writing novels in New York, dancing under the neon lights of some smoky jazz club. She was polite, kind, well-liked by the neighbours, but she didn't belong to that life, not really. She belonged to somewhere else. She belonged to the horizon. In her drawer, under her socks, Bonnie kept a small green journal. The pages were filled with quiet poems, poems about escape, about love that hurt in the best way, about a boy she hadn't met yet, whose voice would be low and soft, whose eyes would hold the road like it was home. She wrote, "Somewhere out there, a boy drives west, with pockets full of silence and a storm in his chest." She didn't know she was writing about Clyde. Not yet. But every word brought him closer. One evening in late spring, Bonnie sat on the porch alone, a small candle flickering beside her. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in syrupy shades of rose and gold. The air was warm, thick with the scent of honeysuckle and dirt. Somewhere in the distance a train wailed its lonely cry. Bonnie sighed. She closed her eyes. And she made a wish. Not out loud, not even in her mind. Just a soft tug in her chest. A whisper from the soul. A wish for change. For someone who could see her, not just the pretty girl with poems and curls, but the wild, restless fire inside. And miles away, across the fields and winding roads of Texas, a boy named Clyde Chestnut Barrow looked up from a gas station bench, heart thudding for no reason at all. He didn't know it either. But Bonnie had just found him. Long before the newspapers wrote his name in bold, long before the stories turned wild and the whispers turned sharp, there was just a boy from West Dallas, Clyde Chestnut Barrow. He wasn't famous. He wasn't fearless. He was just a kid who wanted more than the world handed him. Clyde was born on a hard morning, the kind of morning when the clouds hang low and the wind tastes like dust. His mama, Kumi, held him close and hummed lullabies through cracked lips. His father, Henry, worked wherever he could, shoe shops, farms, rail yards, his hands always full of calluses, his back bent by the weight of time. They lived in a tent for a while, then in a 2-room shack on the edge of West Dallas, where chickens scratched in the yard and wildflowers dared to bloom between broken boards. But Clyde wasn't bothered by the poverty. Not at first, because Clyde had music in his blood. When he was 15, Clyde found a dented saxophone at a pawn shop 2 towns over. It cost more than he had, but he paid in sweat, stacking crates, sweeping floors, fixing tyres for old men who told tall stories. When he finally bought it, he walked home with the case tucked beneath his arm like a treasure. He didn't know how to play, not yet. But that didn't stop him. Nights in the Barrow house were filled with thin notes drifting through the dark. The kind of notes that made the neighbours lean out their windows, notes that bent like sighs, like secrets. Clyde played slow, always slow, like someone talking to the moon. And when he wasn't playing, he was dreaming. Clyde dreamed of cars, not for the speed, not for the theft, but for the feeling, the freedom. He'd lie in bed at night staring at the tin roof above his head and imagine driving west with no destination. Just the road, the stars, and the hum of tyres on warm pavement. Sometimes he saw a girl in the passenger seat. He didn't know her name. She had light in her eyes and a smile like mischief. She laughed with her whole body and wore her hair pinned up with a pencil. He didn't know she was real, not yet. But like Bonnie writing her secret poems, Clyde was calling out in his own quiet way. And the universe was listening. West Dallas wasn't kind to dreamers. There were bills to pay, mouths to feed, and not many chances for boys like Clyde. One wrong turn, one hungry afternoon, and you could find yourself on a road that didn't have a way back. Clyde took a few wrong turns. He borrowed a car that wasn't his. He stole a turkey one Thanksgiving. He helped a friend sneak into a warehouse. Small things, desperate things, things that felt somehow less like crime and more like survival. But still, the shadows grew, and the world began to see him not as a boy with a saxophone and a heart full of music, but as trouble. Clyde didn't argue, he didn't cry, he didn't even explain, he just kept moving. It was a hot July afternoon when Clyde first found himself in a cell. The bars were cold. The room smelled like old coffee and regret. The guard's boots clicked across the floor like a metronome, slow and steady. Clyde didn't speak. He just stared at the sunlight pooling through the window. It looked like melted gold, soft and out of reach. He thought about the road, about the girl with the smile like a poem. He closed his eyes and saw her, laughing, leaning her head on the wind, eyes full of forever. He didn't know her name, but he swore right then that he'd find her, that he'd escape all of this, the bars, the dust, the noise, and find the girl who felt like freedom. Clyde got out that time. His mama came and paid his bail with money she didn't have. She cried when she hugged him, told him to get clean, find work, stay quiet. He tried. He really did. He found a job at a glass company, swept floors, loaded trucks. But the hours were long, and the pay was short, and the dreams were still louder than the work whistle. Clyde didn't want a quiet life. He wanted colour. He wanted wild, beautiful nights under strange skies. He wanted music and poetry and someone who saw him, not just the version others feared, but the real him, the boy who played slow jazz for the stars, the boy who needed to be loved.
One night, Clyde couldn't sleep. The air was thick. The fan on the ceiling spun slow, whispering lullabies in circles. He sat up, shirtless and barefoot, and walked out onto the porch. The stars were soft that night, low, wide, blooming across the Texas sky like spilled ink. He lit a cigarette, took one slow drag, listened to the dogs bark across the fields, and he thought about her again. The girl from his dreams. He whispered into the dark just once, "Where are you?" And somewhere, not so far away, Bonnie Parker sat at her window, writing another poem. 2 lines only. I wait, I ache, I burn to run, for love that starts where roads are done. Clyde's next mistake was bigger, more serious. A stolen car, botched getaway, too many eyes watching. There would be no easy bail this time. There would be weeks behind bars. Weeks of hard bread and harder silence. But this isn't a story about crime, not really. This is a story about 2 people who found each other in a world that didn't know what to do with their kind of love. Because somewhere in the soft stillness of fate's design, the threads were already twisting. Bonnie was writing in her journal. Clyde was carving initials into the wall of his cell. And destiny? Well, destiny was setting the table. The girl with poetry on her lips, the boy with music in his chest. 2 stars on a collision course through the night. World turns quietly when love is near. It doesn't shout, it doesn't knock. It simply opens a door on a Tuesday afternoon and lets 2 souls wander in. It was January 1930. The air in West Dallas was crisp, full of promise. The wind carried hints of wood smoke and rust, and every porch along Eagle Ford Road groaned softly under the weight of time. In a little white house with peeling paint, a friend of Bonnie's, one of those girls who always knew everyone, was nursing a broken arm and the boredom that came with it. Her name was Clarence Clay, but they called her Blanche. She had invited Bonnie over to help with some chores. Nothing important, just sweeping, dishes, maybe a little gossip. But fate had other plans. Because in the living room, leaning against the doorframe with his hands in his pockets and a smirk playing at the edge of his mouth, was a boy Bonnie had never seen before. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, eyes like midnight, deep, unreadable and full of something Bonnie couldn't quite name. A jawline sharp enough to carve stone and a grin that felt like both a warning and a promise. This was Clyde, and in that single breath, before a word was spoken, something inside Bonnie shifted. She didn't blush, she didn't stammer, she just looked at him the way a poet looks at a blank page, with recognition. Clyde looked up as she walked in, his smile softening just a little. He noticed the way her dress clung gently to her waist, the way she carried herself. Light but grounded, like a dancer who'd once been a bird. Her eyes were honey brown but not sweet, there was edge in them. Fire, even behind the calm. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he answered. That was all. But sometimes a single syllable is louder than a lifetime. They didn't fall into love. They stepped into it, quietly, like slipping into a warm stream, one toe at a time. They spent the afternoon in the kitchen, talking over chipped mugs and second-hand chairs. He told her about his saxophone. She told him about her poetry. They didn't share everything, not yet. But they offered just enough, like puzzle pieces, turned slowly in the light. Bonnie laughed more that day than she had in months, and Clyde watched her like he was afraid to blink. She spoke with her hands, weaving invisible threads in the air. He listened the way most people don't anymore, really listened, like every word might disappear if he didn't catch it in time. Outside the day faded, inside something bloomed, and neither of them tried to name it. Later, when she got home, Bonnie opened her green journal and wrote something new. He looked at me like silence wasn't empty. He smiled like he'd known my name for years. I didn't fall in love today, but I left the window open. He came by the next day. And the day after that. At first he made excuses, said he was dropping something off, just checking in, borrowing a book. But everyone knew why he came. Bonnie, with her quiet voice and her storm spark eyes, had lodged herself somewhere inside him. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to. He just knew that when he wasn't near her, the air felt thinner. They drove together sometimes. Clyde had access to a beat-up Ford, borrowed, bartered, or maybe taken without full permission. The radio barely worked, but they didn't need it. They had stories, glances, the sound of wind through open windows. Bonnie would put her bare feet on the dashboard, curl one hand under her chin, and talk about Paris, about wanting to write a book one day, about how some people are born with dust in their lungs and stars in their veins. Clyde didn't talk much, but when he did, it mattered. "You don't belong here," he said one night. "Neither do you," she answered. They looked at each other, and the road stretched out ahead like a promise. There's no photograph from that first week, no snapshot of the moment they knew. But if there were, it wouldn't show fireworks or tears or vows. It would show 2 people sitting side by side in the front seat of a Ford, bathed in the blue-grey light of dusk. Her head turned slightly toward him, his hand resting gently between them, not quite touching hers. 2 hearts beating quietly in rhythm, not yet lovers, not yet legends, just Bonnie and Clyde. That night, Bonnie lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. The fan spun slowly above her. The shadows of her curtains danced across the walls, and in her chest something new pulsed. Not fear, not longing, just knowing. She didn't reach for her journal, she didn't need to, because some things don't need to be written, they just are. Clyde didn't sleep much that night either. He sat on the steps outside his family's house, the porch boards warm from the day. He thought about Bonnie's voice, the way it curved at the end of certain words.
The way she made loneliness feel like something beautiful, instead of something to hide. And for the first time in years, Clyde didn't think about running. He thought about staying, about what it would be like to build something with someone who saw him. Not the troublemaker, not the thief, not the name on a wanted poster, just him. And in that small, sweet silence, a plan began to form. Not for a robbery or a heist or some dusty escape, but for love.
The road has a sound. Not loud, not sharp, but soft, like a lullaby that hums beneath your wheels and sings beneath your breath. It's the sound of leaving, of forgetting, of beginning again. That was the sound Bonnie and Clyde heard one April morning, just after the rain, when they climbed into the old Ford and drove away from everything they'd ever known. No plans, no maps, just a few dollars in Clyde's pocket and Bonnie's poems tucked between the pages of a borrowed book. They didn't tell anyone, not right away. Bonnie left a note for her mother. It was short and soft. Not an apology, not a goodbye, just a promise. I'll be safe. I'll be loved. I'll come back when I'm whole. Clyde left nothing. He figured anyone who knew him already expected he'd leave eventually. But this was different. He wasn't running from something. He was running towards something. Her. Their first day on the road was made of soft winds and long silences. They passed wheat fields glowing gold in the morning light, little towns that blinked sleepily in the sun, gas stations with crooked signs and sleepy dogs curled up in the shade. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Bonnie sat with her legs crossed, her journal open, one finger tapping gently against the window in rhythm with the passing fence posts. Clyde drove with one hand on the wheel and one eye on her reflection in the glass. At a red light, in a town whose name they never learned, Bonnie turned to him and asked, "Do you think the sky is different in other places?" Clyde smiled without looking at her. "I think it's just waiting to be seen different," he said. She wrote that line down in her journal. By midday they stopped near a small grove of trees and made sandwiches out of whatever they had. Bread, a bit of ham, one apple split in half. They sat on the hood of the car, legs dangling. Birds rustled in the branches, sunlight filtered through the leaves like soft lace. Clyde told a story about a time he tried to play the saxophone at a church service and got kicked out for playing the wrong song. Bonnie laughed so hard she nearly dropped her apple, and Clyde felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. That night, they slept in the car under a velvet sky full of stars. No hotel, no bed, just a blanket stretched across the back seat and the sound of crickets brushing the silence. Bonnie lay with her head on Clyde's chest, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing. She traced the shape of his collarbone with her fingertips and whispered, "This feels like a movie no one's watching." Clyde whispered back, "Maybe it's just for us." The next morning they found a radio station playing slow jazz out of Tulsa. The sound crackled in and out, but it didn't matter. It gave the car a heartbeat, gave their silences a soundtrack. Bonnie hummed along. Clyde tapped the steering wheel like a drum, and somewhere in the middle of the song he reached over, took her hand, and kissed it. Not like a gesture, but like a habit. Bonnie didn't say anything. She just leaned her head against his shoulder. The road went on, and so did they. In a diner outside of Amarillo, while Clyde filled the tank, Bonnie scribbled a few lines on a napkin. "I don't need Paris, I don't need pearls, just the hum of your tyres and the sky that unfurls. No dresses, no dances, no crowds, no clatter, just us on the highway and nothing else matters." She folded it, tucked it into her journal, and smiled to herself. She was in love. They didn't talk about the future, not because they were afraid of it, but because this right now was enough. The road became a cocoon. Gas stations were castles. Abandoned barns became hotel rooms. Old fields became stages where they danced in the moonlight, barefoot and breathless. Each day was stitched together from moments, an inside joke, a finger trailing out the window, a roadside kiss that tasted like oranges. And in those moments the world forgot who they were. Not outlaws, not rebels, not legends, just Bonnie and Clyde, lovers, dreamers, wanderers beneath the sky. On the third night they found a quiet spot near a creek and built a small fire. Bonnie roasted marshmallows on a stick she found. Clyde played a low, slow melody on his harmonica. The stars leaned in, listening. Bonnie watched the fire flicker across his face and whispered, "I wish we could stay in this moment forever." Clyde looked at her, eyes shining in the dark. "Maybe we are," he said. "Maybe forever is just a string of moments like this one." They didn't believe in luck, or fate, or even hope. Not really. But they believed in each other. They believed that no matter where they went or what happened tomorrow, this road would always be theirs. Theirs to claim, theirs to write, theirs to remember when the world got loud again. And so they drove, softly, slowly, endlessly, through the places most people forget. In love, not with escape, but with each other. Some people keep journals. Bonnie wrote love letters. Not the kind you send, the kind you write in your mind, the kind you tuck between your ribs and carry with you like a secret. A mile on the road, every silence between songs, every stolen kiss beneath a sky too wide for wishes. Bonnie turned it into verse. And though she never read the poems aloud, Clyde could feel them, like music between breaths, like sunlight through the window. By the 5th week on the road, Bonnie's green journal was full, so she bought a new one. A little black book with gold-trimmed pages, found in a tiny corner shop in Santa Rosa. The clerk didn't ask questions, Bonnie didn't offer answers. She took it back to the car, and that night under a cottonwood tree, she began again. This time, not just poems, letters, to Clyde, but never addressed, never dated, just written. You're asleep beside me right now. I can hear the quiet rhythm of your breath, and the occasional twitch of your hand, like you're still driving, even in your dreams. You always look so serious when you sleep, like the world is heavy, even when you're resting. I want to take that weight from you. I want to hold your heart in my hands like something delicate, something worth keeping still. You don't know this, but sometimes I stay awake just to watch your chest rise and fall. That's what love is to me. Breath shared between two people, soft and wordless. Clyde wasn't a writer. He didn't carry notebooks or read poetry. He didn't quote things or underline passages. But he felt deeply, always had. Sometimes, after dinner, while Bonnie scribbled in her journal, he'd lean against the car and stare into the trees, thinking, remembering, loving her in ways words didn't quite know how to hold. I love the way you drive. Not fast like they say you do, not reckless, but with purpose, with music in your hands. I've watched you navigate rows like you're playing a piano, each curve and turn and note in some symphony only you can hear. When you drive, I feel safe, not because the world disappears, but because you never let it touch us. I've fallen in love with the road because of you. And even if we stopped tomorrow, I think I'd still feel it. The motion, the rhythm, the hum. You've made my heart a passenger. They didn't travel in straight lines. Sometimes they took back roads just because the name of the town made Bonnie smile. Sometimes they stopped to watch a storm roll in, even if it meant being late to nowhere. Once, they came across an abandoned train car in a field, covered in ivy, leaning like it was tired from too many years. They crawled inside, lay on the dusty floor and made up stories about the people who used to ride there. We could be anyone, Bonnie said. We already are, Clyde replied. There's something I've been thinking about. It's the space between us, between our fingers when we hold hands, between the silences in our conversations. I think that's where love lives. Not in the kissing or the confessions, but in the space, the stillness, the way I can sit beside you and feel whole even when no one's talking. It's magic, isn't it? How someone can become home without ever asking you to stay. One night, as they parked beside a shallow river and watched fireflies blink across the sky, Bonnie handed Clyde the black notebook. He looked at her confused. She nodded once. "Read them," she said. He didn't read fast, but he read carefully, each letter, each line, like a whisper into his chest. When he finished, he closed the book and didn't say a word. He leaned in, kissed her forehead, and held her for a long time, arms wrapped tight like he never wanted to let go. "I don't have words like you," he whispered into her hair, "but if I did, they'd all be yours." As they travelled, Bonnie began to read her letters aloud, just before bed, just one or two, not for attention, not for praise, but to be heard. Clyde would lie with his hands behind his head, eyes closed, listening as her voice wove through the trees and stars. It became their nightly ritual. Her voice, his silence, words and presence, poetry and peace. Odds the stars could speak, they'd speak in hush, in whispers soft in twilight's brush. If the moon could write, it'd write like me, with longing laced in poetry. You sleep beside me, warm and real, and suddenly the night can feel. I found my peace, my road, my truth, in you, my love and reckless youth. The road didn't stop. Not yet. The miles kept spinning, the world kept turning. But for a while, maybe longer than anyone expected, Bonnie and Clyde lived in a dream that stretched from highway to horizon. A dream stitched together by ink and breath, by stolen time and sleeping skies. And in that dream, love wasn't dangerous. It was quiet, it was true. It was a notebook passed between hearts. A poem written in the pause before sleep. The end doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it comes like dusk. Soft and slow, creeping in on the edges. Not a full stop, just a breath, a pause, a hush before the final note. That's how it came to Bonnie and Clyde. They didn't talk about stopping. They didn't speak the word ending, but something had shifted in the air. Not fear, not regret, just a quiet knowing. A feeling that maybe the road had taken them as far as it could. They stopped in a town so small it didn't bother with signs. One street, a gas station, a shuttered diner, a chapel that looked more like a barn than a place of prayer. It was near the edge of Oklahoma. The air was still and thick with summer. Clyde pulled into a field just past the edge of town and turned off the engine. They sat in silence for a moment, the heat buzzing around them like a lullaby. Bonnie looked out across the golden grass, then back at him. "Let's stay here," she whispered, "just for tonight." Clyde nodded, and so they did. As the sun dipped low, Clyde gathered wood and made a small fire. Bonnie set out the blanket, the same one they'd used in a dozen places, a dozen times. It smelled like lavender and dust. They didn't have much food, a few crackers, some peaches from a roadside stand, a bottle of Coca-Cola still cool from the gas station fridge. But it felt like a feast. Bonnie lit a candle and placed it between them. Just one, a tiny flame, flickering against the gathering dark. And then, they danced. There was no music, just the sound of night, crickets, wind, the faint hum of memory. Clyde stood first, held out his hand. Bonnie looked up at him, her eyes full of surprise and something softer. "Dance with me," he said. "Right here, right now," she stood. No shoes, no floor, just bare feet in the grass, fingers curled into fingers, breath matched to breath. They swayed, slowly, gently, a rhythm made only for them. And in that moment, under the darkening sky, it felt like the world had stilled. The stars came out, quiet and endless. Above them, the sky spun slow, galaxies breathing, constellations leaning in to watch. Clyde rested his chin on Bonnie's head. She closed her eyes and held him tighter. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Everything they'd ever meant to tell each other lived in that dance, in the weight of her hand in his, in the rise and fall of their breath, in the hush between heartbeat. Later, lying side by side beneath the stars, Bonnie reached for Clyde's hand. "Do you think we'll be remembered?" she asked. He looked up thinking. Then, "Maybe, but I don't care if the world forgets us, as long as you don't." Bonnie smiled. "I won't. Not even when I'm dust." "Me neither." A pause. Then Clyde whispered, "This, right now, is the only forever I ever wanted." They didn't sleep much that night. Not because they were afraid, but because it felt too sacred to close their eyes. They watched the stars spin, listened to the fire crackle, held each other like a promise. It wasn't goodbye, it wasn't the end. It was the moment before both, stretched out like a poem, tender and complete. That night, Bonnie wrote one last page in her black notebook. "I've lived 1,000 lives in these past weeks, as a poet, a lover, a girl wrapped in sky. But tonight, I was just Bonnie, your Bonnie, and if this is the last page, let it be soft, let it be gold-lit and quiet. Let it end, not in fear, but in a dance, beneath a sky that never stopped watching. Just before dawn, the fire turned to ash. Clyde curled behind Bonnie, arm draped over her side, fingers laced with hers. Their breathing slowed, the world held its breath, and the two of them slipped into sleep. Not as legends, not as names in history books, but as two souls finally still, together. The world woke before they did. A soft wind stirred the grass, the candle had burned out. The sky was a watercolour of grey and gold, and Bonnie and Clyde, they slept. Wrapped together beneath the blanket, her head on his chest, his hand gently curled against her spine. To anyone who passed by, they looked like any other couple who had drifted off beneath the stars. Peaceful, still, as if the road had finally given them what they came for, rest. And perhaps, in some quiet, impossible way, it had. There were no more engines starting, no more maps folded and refolded, no more eyes glancing in the mirror, checking for shadows. Just the hush, just the morning, and the slow promise of a day that would come without expectation or chase. They had outrun the noise, not in speed, but in love, not in fury, but in stillness. This wasn't the end the world would tell, but it was the ending they wrote, without saying a word. The black notebook lay open beside Bonnie's hand, the final page fluttering gently in the breeze. There were no new words on it, only space, white, clean, untouched, as if even poetry had grown quiet. And in that silence, the story came to rest. That day the sun rose slowly, like it didn't want to wake them. Birds sang softly in the trees. The creek whispered nearby, gentle and endless, and above it all, the sky, that eternal sky, watched over them like an old friend. There was no tragedy here, no sorrow, only a love that had burned so brightly it had simply settled into stillness. So now, the story closes, softly, no curtains, no crowds, just the sound of your own breathing, a feeling of stillness settling in your chest. Bonnie and Clyde didn't ride off into a storm, they didn't disappear into legend. They found each other, they fell in love, and they wrote their story one slow mile at a time. Through dust and dusk, through letters and lullabies, through kisses under cottonwood trees and firelight dancing on skin. And in the end, they didn't need a destination, because the journey was enough. As you listen to their final night, let yourself drift. Let your heartbeat slow. Let your thoughts soften, like footsteps fading behind you. You are safe. You are still. Like Bonnie, like Clyde, you've made it. Through another day. Into this moment. Into this breath. Let go of tomorrow. The stars are up. The sky is wide. And somewhere, in a memory written in moonlight, two dreamers are still dancing under a quiet sky. Together. Forever. And so, may you rest too. Good night, sleep well, and dream gently.